a discussion of the Venezuelan elections, which are happening this Sunday. And so I thought it was important that we have Anya on. And right now I'm trying to, we're live on Rockfin, Twitter, and YouTube. I wanted to have Anya on because she has a new book out that most of you know about called Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire, which really sets the stage for what is taking place now. And the U.S. has put forward its chosen candidate. She's not running, but she is de facto running through a lesser known figure who's basically her Trojan horse. This is the latest Bolivarian revolution that was launched by Hugo Chavez, democratic means. And they want to end it. They've tried to end it through undemocratic means, but now they have been reduced to trying to unseat Nicolas Maduro, Chavez's chosen successor, through an election. So Anya, put this election into the context of your book. Are we still witnessing a corporate coup through this election? What are the stakes, and who are the figures involved here in leading the opposition past the Juan Guaidó era?
Well, this is the election that will, in some regards, determine the future leadership of the Venezuelan opposition, because Juan Guaidó, the corporate coup figurehead, is, as we know, in Miami, I guess taking graduate student classes or something like that at Florida International University. And the main scion of the Venezuelan aristocracy, who is the poster boy of the opposition, Leopoldo Lopez, is in Spain. And so it was left to Maria Corina Machado initially to bear the torch during this latest campaign. And it's shocking, really, that she was the best the opposition could come up with, because she's really the OG, along with Leopoldo Lopez, anti-Chavista, extremist opposition candidate that has been around, that has been in the pocket of the U.S. government since Chavez was elected in 1998. I write about Maria Corina in the book just because she was at the forefront of the 2002 coup attempt that temporarily removed Chavez from office, when she signed the famous Carmona decree that temporarily froze Venezuela's government and installed the leader of their version of the Commerce Department head of the government. And then they got all these civil society organizations to endorse the coup. She was a part of that, and then immediately began raising funds from the U.S. State Department and the National Endowment for Democracy for her civil society organizations, that then subsequently later ran another campaign to remove Chavez from office, collecting signatures on a referendum. Also failed in that instance. But she, at that time, worked with the wife of Ricardo Hausman, one of the main functionaries of the Guaidó coup attempt that I write about extensively in the book, in order to gain these signatures and then run a campaign claiming that they had won the referendum, even though there was no hard evidence that they could point to. She used her connections with Hausman and MIT and elite U.S. universities to produce a report claiming that they'd won, even though there was no evidence they actually put forward to demonstrate that they had. They were just using pure corruption and the corruption of these groups in the U.S. to promote their political agenda. And she's hung around all of these years, about 25 years at this point, collecting money from the United States and advocating for even the military intervention in Venezuela. She's considered more extreme than even Guaidó, because when the U.S. government recognized Guaidó in 2019, she was actually out there calling for the U.S. to militarily intervene and overthrow Maduro's government. So she is extremely radical, even for the Venezuelan opposition. And she initially wanted to be the candidate. She was disqualified due to an accounting issue on her submission. But it's kind of also, if you could imagine someone that is actually what they say about Trump being a paid Russian agent here to overthrow our democracy. That's literally what she is in Venezuela, operating on behalf of the US. And so the fact that she was even considered for the role of a candidate is outrageous. Nobody in the U.S. context, if they were getting money from a foreign entity, would be allowed to run here. I think that's clear. But she still acted as the radical gas behind Edmundo Gonzalez's campaign. This is the gentleman that actually is the official opposition candidate, and she campaigned heavily with him. He put out a tweet thanking her at his final campaign rally, thanking her for her contribution to his campaign. And Edmundo Gonzalez is also a pretty shocking example of what the opposition have to work with, because he's someone who's extremely old. He was not even really able to stand up at his campaign rally. He looked a little bit like Joe Biden at his rally there, and he actually is was a longtime diplomat serving in the pre-revolution foreign ministry in Venezuela. And he had a long stint at the Venezuelan embassy in El Salvador at a time when the U.S. was running a dirty war there and in Nicaragua throughout the 1980s. And he was, because the Venezuelan government then was so closely allied with the United States, he was acting with the United States, coordinating those reactionary and dangerous, deadly wars in Central America. I'm willing to bet probably that he was working personally with Elliot Abrams at the time, who we know actually is still in the Biden administration advising and was Trump's Venezuela envoy overseeing this coup policy. So they didn't really have anybody new and young and fresh to run. I guess they failed at that with Juan Guaidó, and then everybody left. A lot of their other main candidates left. And I do think that the Guaidó faction, Leopoldo, these figures that are outside of the United States, they don't actually want to see a victory there of Edmundo Gonzalez, because then they're sidelined as the leaders of the opposition. And they would much rather, I think, continue to act as the foreign opposition abroad in opposing Maduro, and rather than actually governing. So that's where we are here. I don't think that anybody takes it seriously that there's really a chance that Gonzalez will win, but surely it will be an opportunity for the Chavista camp there to demonstrate that they're stronger than ever. I mean, in many ways, the Guaidó coup attempt made Chavismo and Maduro stronger than they would have been without it. I think they were able to consolidate a lot of support and show the opposition for what it was, which was an extreme entity that actually was willing to promote the idea of war in Venezuela.
Featuring Edmundo Gonzalez, who is clearly very old and was leaning on the lectern. And this is, this is from 2019 when we were in Venezuela. This was a week before we arrived. Maria Corina Machado was issuing a call for humanitarian intervention. It's lagging. We're lagging a little bit here. But she issued a call openly for humanitarian intervention by the U.S., a Libya-style humanitarian R2P intervention. I mean, that's more extreme than what we were hearing at the time from Juan Guaidó, although he de facto endorsed that just through USAID. So it feels like they're at the end of the line. And Anya, you actually interviewed Maria Corina Machado. You kind of ambushed her it wasn't a rally. I mean, what she was doing was she was outside the Carlota Air Base in Caracas, basically trying to get people to storm inside a military base in Caracas during a military coup when the U.S. was sending trucks across the Venezuelan border from Colombia. This makes even if you believe January 6th was an insurrection, it pales in comparison to what she was doing. And this is the candidate. This is the chosen candidate that the New York Times is puffing as like the next Margaret Thatcher. I mean, maybe appropriately so. referring to her as like the Iron Lady of Venezuela. So, I mean, there are polls actually showing her in first place, but you expect her to lose.
Well, she's not on the ballot.
I mean, you expect her side to lose.
Yeah, there are private polls claiming that there's the opposition has a chance. I would be surprised if they pulled that off at this point, at this stage. But that day that we saw her in Caracas, it wasn't just that she was trying to get Venezuelans to storm the airbase. She and that crowd were trying to encourage Venezuelan soldiers to defect and join them, because this was the same day that, as you mentioned, the U.S. was attempting to deliver humanitarian aid, they claimed, over the border with U.S. military trucks. And the only way that plot would have succeeded is if large swaths of the Venezuelan military defected. That's what Trump and Bolton were pressuring them to do. It was open in their statements at the time, and I compiled them in the book. They were telling the military that if they stood by Maduro on that day, that they would face pain and suffering like never before. It was, in my view, clearly not as much of an attempted invasion as much it was as an attempt to stoke divisions within the Venezuelan military and kind of test to see how united it was. And Venezuela showed that they were united, and a handful of military personnel defected, but not enough to inspire the United States to further that policy of pressing on the border. They saw pretty clearly that the Venezuelan military was going to defend their nation, and so that plot fell apart. But Maria Corina was there in Caracas at this airbase trying to get soldiers inside to join their revolt, and she failed completely. I mean, the energy at that rally died out pretty rapidly from what I recall after she just gave a little speech. And I just ran up to her and asked her why she supported a military intervention in her country. And she just kind of brushed me aside and just said, like, the fight for liberty continues. She was in a daze, really. But by then, I think it was clear the opposition knew that they had no chance at victory on that day. So they just, actually, I remember they all just started walking home and going into all the restaurants in the eastern Caracas neighborhood where they'd gathered and had lunch, and kind of were just, I think I wrote in the book that they were like disappointed soccer fans at that stage.
Yeah, no, it was pathetic to witness it peter out. And I think that we saw more from Caracas than we saw from the border, where the whole aid theater took place, and which we later exposed or helped expose the opposition for actually burning their own trucks in a false flag attack. Never got credit from the New York Times for that one. But on the subject of the corporate coup, there's a lot of drama behind the scenes here, because the corporate coup, the sort of the thesis of your book, is that Juan Guaidó and these characters were basically a front for a wider program by Carlos Vecchio. His U.S. fake ambassador was a longtime lawyer for Exxon, and the goal was to strip Venezuela's public assets and wealth and put it in the hands of Washington, stealing Venezuela's gold from the Bank of England. And so Venezuela's most valuable foreign asset, Citgo, there's been this plot, which you track very closely in your book, to take Citgo, wrest it from the hands of the Venezuelan state, to deprive it of its oil wealth. So where is Citgo today? There seems to be a big decision coming up around it.
It's already done. The coup succeeded. The judgments against Citgo all came through because of the plot that I detail in the book, all the dirty dealings that Jose Ignacio Hernandez, the so-called special prosecutor or attorney general under Guaido's regime, shadow regime, made after taking over in the eyes of U.S. courts. They actually worked against the interest of the Venezuelan state. They were apparently out there working for, and instead were, you know, in Hernandez's case, he was actually a paid witness in the trial previously who'd testified on behalf of the corporations that were suing Venezuela in order to get Citgo's assets. And so he was actually playing for the other team. That's what I detail in the book. And as a result, Citgo stood to be liquidated on July 16th. The judge has already been overseeing this fire sale, and it's a court in Delaware that's actually reviewing various offers from oil companies that are seeking to buy up Citgo's assets. And this isn't just money. This is actually the way that it works is like these companies come in and buy Citgo pipelines and refinery plants at a fire sale and then take them over for themselves. The oil market kind of further monopolizes. And so because of the political situation, because Citgo, if Citgo had been officially lost and sold off on July 16th, that would have been a huge boon to Maduro because it would make the opposition look extremely bad, having squandered Venezuela's main assets. So the judge took a political decision to delay that decision, the review of the fire sale until September. And so rather than auctioning off Citgo this month, it'll happen in September. And it's very likely that ExxonMobil, the company that employed Carlos Vecchio, Guaido's so-called ambassador to the United States, will benefit greatly from that sale and buy up Citgo's corpse for cheap and gain a share of the oil market while Citgo dies. And that's really the way the corporate coup was designed to work in the end. And so they succeeded in that regard. And, you know, there are efforts from people in even the opposition to say that Citgo workers deserve compensation because of the fact that they haven't been able to get paid since these sanctions came down, that they should actually be the ones that benefit from the sale of Citgo and not the Venezuelan shadow puppet regime that manages its accounts. And so there are actually even lawsuits that members of the opposition have filed in Delaware in order to win those judgments and assistance for Citgo workers. But they're running into their own issues in Delaware. It looks very much like these judges are corrupt. I'll say that much, because they just side with the oil companies in all of these decisions. They don't want to hear the case from average people that have had their lives destroyed by this corporate coup. They were even actually, there are members of the opposition that have a lawsuit to say that they have a claim to the judgment, the Citgo money that comes through this fire sale, and it should be used to pay for the cancer treatment of Venezuelan children that was actually blocked as a result of sanctions. And the courts have not moved on that either. The judge doesn't want to honor, you know, sick children asking for money. They'd rather turn to the oil companies and to the Venezuelan opposition.
That's sickening. And, you know, we keep hearing about Maduro being weakened, being extremely unpopular. You know, where does Maduro stand in the shadow of Chavez with the Venezuelan people? And how do you assess his popularity? And what does Maduro represent against the legacy of Chavez at this point, not just in Venezuela's history, but looking at it from kind of a geopolitical perspective? He was Chavez's former foreign minister. Where does he what does he represent as a figure on the world stage? And I should mention, you know, from my own perspective, just watching his campaign, he's had a very simple appeal to people, which is that we are not puppets of the U.S. They are. We stand for sovereignty. That's been basically his message all along, drawing some pretty large crowds, even though Venezuela is obviously in dire economic trouble from sanctions, and many people are leaving the country.
Yeah, well, Venezuela is not doing as poorly as it was several years ago, which I think people are surprised. Maduro really defied all odds by lasting the way that he has, and by even turning around the economy to some degree. You can see in recent years, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, they've all had to acknowledge that the era of hyperinflation and shortages in Venezuela were managed and turned around by mainly Venezuela embarking on this international campaign to be a major player in the emerging multipolar world. And Maduro's really spearheaded this. That's why Alex Saab, the U.S. was so obsessed with targeting him, because the Venezuelan diplomat that was not only helping feed Venezuelans under sanctions by supplying them with the clap boxes. Maduro actually launched this program, right, to deliver, we've covered it many times on the Grayzone, household products and food to Venezuelans free of charge. That was his way of circumventing sanctions and kind of just making sure that Venezuelans could eat and support themselves while they face the difficult period of having been cut off really from the international market. And they were able to do that by going out to the world, going to Turkey, to Iran, to places that Venezuela was not traditionally closely aligned with, or that were even on the other side of the world, in order to get these products, in order to get food, and also to get money, and as in an exchange. And that is why the U.S. arrested Alex Saab and was so focused on sabotaging that network, because it was a lifeline that Venezuela built in order to survive, and in order for their people not to starve. I cite one opposition study by a member of the opposition, a Maduro critic, Francisco Rodriguez, who says that program CLAP actually prevented famine in Venezuela. And, he broke it down also in demonstrating how Venezuelans, regardless of their political affiliation, were benefiting from that program. And so it was that kind of innovation when it comes to international relations and domestic policy that enabled Maduro to survive much longer. And the fact that he's the candidate running in this election and still has, good chance at winning, says that, the policy that the U.S. had of, well, first of all, hoping that Chavismo just died alongside Chavez failed, but then their effort to unseat Maduro failed. And he, I think, is stronger, much stronger than he was in 2019 when this coup process began. But his legacy will definitely be turning Venezuela, and Chavez already began this process, but Maduro will, I think, be seen as having completed the process of bringing Venezuela into this new world. I'm pretty confident that at the BRICS summit later this year in Russia, that Venezuela will be among the new states admitted to BRICS as well. So that'll be then a new project that Maduro's government will have in terms of like building the actual financial system and international economy that's no longer going to easily be sanctioned and manipulated by the transatlantic powers. It's kind of an exciting time to witness.
Max, you're muted, but I'm here. Yeah, Max, we still can't. I couldn't hear Max there. Could you, Anya?
No. And now it looks that he's frozen. So
yeah.
Well, hi, Aaron.
Hey, Anya. Hey. Well, yeah, Max, we can't hear you. So either because you're muted or lagging or both.
Well, if I'm not lagging now, I'm tossing to you, Aaron, and welcoming you into the discussion. I know you have a question for Anya, and then I'm going to change locations so that I get better internet coverage. So go for it.
Anya, I wanted to ask you about some of the prevailing narratives that we're getting about Venezuela and the establishment media. But first, actually, I wanted to share with you some new reporting that tracks with everything you've been saying from the start of Trump's coup attempt. In fact, even before, which is this. This is a headline in today's Washington Post, which says this: Trump White House was warned sanctions on Venezuela could fuel migration. The internal debate over the policy underscores how U.S. financial measures can sometimes lead to unintended consequences. Well, I would take issue with that. I think the whole point was of the sanctions was to create a crisis in Venezuela, including migration. But this is some of the reporting, and it just tracks with everything that you could read about in the Grayzone for many, many years. Thomas Shannon, who served as Undersecretary of State for political affairs at the State Department under Trump, he now tells the Washington Post this. He says, this is the point I made at the time. I said the sanctions were going to grind the Venezuelan economy into dust and have huge human consequences, one of which would be out-migration. The sanctions clearly helped generate faster out-migration, and you knew it was only going to be a matter of time before these people decided to migrate north. So now, of course, after the damage is done, a top U.S. official admits that there were warnings inside the Trump administration that their sanctions would cause migration, the very issue that Donald Trump sort of staked his political identity around, which now we're newly confirming he knowingly fueled by imposing these murderous sanctions on Venezuela. And this article has other anecdotes, including that Mexican officials also made the same point to John Bolton and other top Trump officials. And John Bolton claims he didn't remember hearing that warning. But I'm just wondering your response to this. I mean, this is something this is a point you've been making for as long as you've been talking about this issue, that these sanctions on Venezuela knowingly cause the migration that the U.S. claims it wants to stop, and that Trump staked his political identity around.
Yeah, this is when I love the mainstream media, when they are able to get former officials telling the truth in this way, where it's kind of, at this point, it's late. That's the time when they can roll it out once the damage is done. But wow, what an incredible admission there from Shannon and from the Post to something that's completely obvious to anyone who's been paying attention, which is that if you destroy a country in our hemisphere, we're going to have feel the effects of that on our own border. And it's worth noting that, I mean, Trump, yes, he bears responsibility for those sanctions, but the one policy request from the opposition that he refused to grant while in office was that he give Venezuelans temporary protected status. He didn't do that probably because he thought that was his insurance against having an influx of migrants at the border. Biden came in and within 2 months granted Venezuelans temporary protected status. And that's when we saw this major influx, people realizing if they get here, they're going to get to work and get special treatment immediately, especially if they come up with some story about how they're going to be politically persecuted if they ever go back to Venezuela. So that's when these numbers started increasing. But what's interesting is that I just recently had an event in New York City with current Foreign Minister Ivan Gil in Venezuela, and he talked about the fact that his government has made an effort to try and repatriate they've acted to repatriate a lot of migrants that left and ended up all scattered throughout South America. This is actually an official policy of their foreign ministry called Vuelta a la Patria, return to the homeland. And so thousands, hundreds of Venezuelans have returned to Venezuela from Chile, Argentina, places where Venezuela actually sends a plane. Because what happens is these migrants get to their destination and they realize, oh, the life that we were promised here is non-existent. Actually, life may have been better for us back home. We want to go back. And so Venezuela's been doing this, and they've attempted to do that even with the United States. And because the Biden administration refuses to cross a certain line in terms of their relationship with the Venezuelan government, they're not able to service Venezuelans here who might even want to go back to Venezuela. And he complained about that. And he also complained about the fact that they don't have an embassy here, which is outrageous for, I guess, 4 years now. Because of this coup policy, the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. and all of their consular offices around the country have sat empty. There's nobody in there that can provide visas or consular services to these migrants that are now here in the United States. And so it's an unprecedented disaster. I mean, to actually destroy a country, then incentivize their people to come here, and yet not have relations with that government, so they can't take care of the migrants here or even bring them back to Venezuela if they would like. So it's you have to wonder, do they even care about migration? Because sometimes it feels like they even want that they can pretend like they're against it and make rhetoric, divide people, because that's always helpful. But maybe they want the cheap labor here. I mean, that's the only conclusion that I can draw based on the fact that they have all the evidence and the information there when they make these decisions too. So.
And, similar to what drives Israel in trying to destroy Gaza, just they hate disobedience. Anybody who's outside of their control has to be destroyed, even if it has consequences like causing millions of refugees fleeing. The consequences of, as you talked about, their economies being destroyed. But hegemony supersedes everything else. I think people like John Bolton, Pompeo, that's all they can see. And more from this Washington Post article, it says that the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Intelligence and Analysis delivered classified assessments to the White House Security Council and top DHS officials in at least 4 reports between 2017 and 2019. And these reports warned that harsh sanctions on Venezuela would accelerate the country's economic collapse and speed an exodus of millions of migrants to neighboring nations. And it's just so funny that this was like kept from the public and classified assessments when you were talking about this very publicly. I remember you going on Tucker Carlson's show and trying to speak to Trump and telling him that his policies would cause exactly that. And now only, many years later, we're what, like 5 years after the coup attempt began?
How time flies.
Yeah. But I want you to respond to some narratives that this Washington Post article and pretty much and virtually every single other corporate media account of Venezuela advances, which is that, first of all, Venezuela's people suffering was an unintended consequence of the sanctions. And 2, that the sanctions were a response to human rights abuses by Maduro. And 3, the third trope that I wanted you to respond to, well, those first 2, and then I'll remember the third. But yes, that this was an unintended consequence and that the sanctions were designed to respond to human rights abuses and authoritarianism. Oh, and also, okay, yes. And that, and that the economic crisis in Venezuela preceded U.S. sanctions. So we can't really blame U.S. sanctions for Venezuela's struggles because it was already in crisis. So really, the sanctions were not that determinative in Venezuela's struggles. Those are the narratives that I'd love to hear you respond to because they're very prevalent.
So let's start with the last point that you just made, that the sanctions were not responsible. So the first Venezuela sanctions came down in 2015 under the Obama administration in response to the violent Guarimba protests that had erupted the previous year, sponsored by the United States, when Maduro cracked down and jailed people. And these were extremely violent protests. You can watch the videos online. I think a lot of other reporters have done good documentation of what happened there. But when Maduro cracked down on it, then they used that narrative to say, oh, there's human rights abuses in Venezuela, so we had to do this like human rights sanctions package. But before they did that, the Obama administration did something arguably more significant, which was to classify Venezuela as a national security threat. That wasn't sanctioned. That wasn't an official act of sanctions. But that immediately placed Venezuela's economy in unprecedented conditions, because what happened is Venezuela for decades had been dependent on outside imports for basic goods. It was a petrostate ever since oil was discovered there in the 1920s. And because it had such a strong relationship with the United States, the IMF, the world international, market, they were able to import the goods that they needed as long as they gave their oil to the foreign companies that wanted to be there. It was a happy relationship. That began to change under Chavez, but then with the National Security Declaration, what that did is it sent a message to any international banker or insurance company, shipping company, that Venezuela was on the target list of, if the U.S. is calling you a national security threat, who knows what they're going to do? Are you going to go to war tomorrow? And so the cost of doing business with Venezuela went up just like that drastically. Insurance premiums on shipping, some tripled. in some cases, just because of that security declaration. And that is when we saw a major decrease in Venezuela's ability to import. And it cut Venezuela's private sector off from dollars and from the international market. Because so even though Venezuela is like a socialist country, that's what they call themselves, I show in the book, and I show all the government data, that 2/3 of its economy, at least or more, is still private. It's not like the state controls every hotel and grocery store. No, all of that in Venezuela, it's private. And so that the government wasn't the one in charge of importing all of these goods. It was just the private sector. And suddenly they, because of this national security declaration, were unable to get the capital and the goods that they were just typically for decades able to bring in. And so in my book, I talk about this Stratfor report. They're this private intelligence company, basically a private CIA that does assessments and reports for companies and governments around the world. They took 2 pictures of Venezuela's main import hub, their main port, and showed that in 2014, it had, thousands of shipping containers, and it was totally filled and bustling. And then after this national security declaration in 2015, it was pretty much empty. And they say that it's just because of Maduro's mismanagement, but left out the very real economics behind how the national security declaration then also resulted in a downgrade of Venezuela's credit rating with, Moody's, these international credit companies that give like the Congo and Iraq very higher credit ratings than Venezuela, even just because by the sheer act of downgrading them, they did further damage to their ability to bring in money and goods. So it was this like long-term plan, even before the official sanctions came down, that really strangled Venezuela's economy. And this is all because of, international dollar dependency and these issues in the global economy that are now changing for the first time. But then the sanctions came down, and those really, there's another study that I cite in the book from Francisco Rodriguez, who's a Venezuelan opposition-aligned economist. Again, a Maduro critic, not a fan of Maduro Chavez at all. Actually, someone who resigned from a position in the government in the early 2000s and came to the U.S. But he analyzed the data showing drops in Venezuela's oil production. And simply by just mapping it out with time series data, just, like a basic graph of Venezuelan oil production, and marking all of the major dates when U.S. sanctions came into effect, he demonstrated that the way he described it is that smoking gun analysis demonstrating that sanctions did drive the downturn in Venezuela's economy, because what he showed is that any time there was a significant drop in the oil market over 10 years, there was always a sanction implemented right on the date when we saw that decline. So, he said that's basically unheard of in data, to have something that clearly illustrating that clearly a cause in drop of production. So I think that was a very compelling piece of evidence as well, that sanctions really do drive the economy. What were the primary contributing factor here? I think he described U.S. sanctions as a surgical strike on Venezuela's oil sector when I spoke with him about that study. But that is, I guess, to address your first point, the intention behind these policies. I think one of the other quotes that I found really useful and highlighted in the book was from Agatha Damaris. She's, I think, works at The Economist, and she did that talk with Matt Duss, you may recall, where she openly said that we put these sanctions on to cause suffer or to put stress on the economy, but it's always a difficult balance, because then people suffer, and it's like, well, what are you admitting there? That's like their own words. Sometimes they can't help but admit that this is actually by design with these policies. So what was the second? Those were the first and the third point. There was a second point that you had in your list of 3.
That this is a response to authoritarianism and human rights abuses.
Oh, right. Well, yeah, that's because of
Sanctions.
the narrative that they made up around the Guarimba protests and claiming that like Carlos Vecchio is a is a victim of Maduro's human rights abuses. He came to the United States after the Guarimbas in 2015 and began this personal campaign, lobbying campaign at the Organization of American States and in the U.S. government to push through these like human rights narratives that he and all the opposition figures that had led the violent clashes in the street were now victims of Maduro and victims of communism. They're honored at that group too. So that's just that was their pretext for then having a sanctions bill that was like protecting human rights in Venezuela. It's just, we know that these people don't actually care about human rights. I think they've done a pretty good job of demonstrating that themselves.
Well, I have that clip that you mentioned from Agath Damaris, and let's listen to it because it's perfectly captured. And this is not a right-wing Trump administration member. This is a liberal think tanker, and this is what she said about sanctions.
Those sanctions that tend to work best are the ones that impose hardship on the population of targeted countries, exactly for the reason that we discussed a few minutes ago, because we want the population of targeted countries to tell their governments that they want them to change course. And so one tool to do that is to fuel inflation in targeted countries by essentially making access to foreign exchange reserves more difficult, for instance. So we need to recognize that this is a policy dilemma. On the one hand, we don't want people in sanctioned countries to suffer, but on the other hand, that's the most effective way for the US to gain concessions from targeted countries. So a very, very difficult policy dilemma, I would say.
What a dilemma. We don't want people to suffer, but we also want to control their countries and their destiny. So therefore, they have to suffer. Sorry. Unbelievable.
And we got about an hour left, and I want to make sure we cover every subject. So I don't know if there's anything you want to say in closing, Anya Parampil, author of Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of Empire.
No, just that story in the Washington Post is really incredible when you consider the fact that when I went on Tucker's show in 2019 to discuss this, he had also cited an Atlantic Council study, I think then, that had come out that said if Venezuela becomes more unstable, we'll get millions of migrants at the southern border. Colonel Douglas McGregor made the same case that day. They knew, Trump knew, anybody who was in charge of crafting this policy knew that it would result in millions of Venezuelans coming here. And so it's cynical how they use then the migrant issue to divide people and make people feel unsafe because they're responsible for it.
I don't know. Maybe they like arepas a lot. Maybe that's really what it was. Because we have like more arepa places in the U.S. than ever before. I mean, they're good. It's good drunk food, you know. But I'm going to drop Anya's book in the chat. I mean, I'm biased, but it's a legit book. Like, it's very readable. It's very accessible. And it gives you the backstory that you're not going to hear on any corporate media network, pretty much any Western media network, about what's going to take place on Sunday. So thanks a lot for bringing that analysis to our audience here at the Grayzone. And
couldn't have done it without such a great support.
Absolutely. Writing a book is insane, as you know, Aaron.
I do. I really do. It's
And
incredibly impressive what Anya did. I also really recommend this book. I'm also very biased, but it's not just about, I mean, it's a fascinating story about Venezuela, but there's a broader story here about just how cynical our rulers are in trying to crush anybody who doesn't obey the rules, and the lengths they go to achieve it, and also how the global South is forming alliances to fight back and to resist. And it's a really impressive piece of work. I highly recommend it for anybody who hasn't picked it up.